Well, this is, of course, what astonishes all of us. There is a great deal of injustice throughout the land. It's getting worse. The vast majority of the people are being pushed down economically. They're being excluded, overcharged, disrespected, marginalized, entertained 24/7. And the commercialism is triumphing over civic values. And whenever a society subordinates, for a variety of reasons, civic values like access to justice and opportunity and respect for posterity and many other aspects of civic values to the supremacy of commercial corporate values, a decay sets in, and we have a plutocratic and oligarchic society. So we know all this, but what is the great unanswered question is, why aren't people motivated to do something about it, either at the local, state, national level, in a whole variety of ways, from showing up with marches and demonstrations to how they choose their elected representatives to how they use the courts to how they make the educational system work and so on. The lack of civic motivation is really the most important, because when you go around the country, people know there's so much that's wrong, and not just in terms of how they're mistreated and marginalized, but they know the trends are wrong. The trends are in the opposite direction, downward, one indicator after another. So I'd like to start by basically saying that the objectives, the redirections for our society will be at the latter end of my brief remarks, and I want to start with the instruments. You can't get anywhere without having tools of democracy. Some of those are in our laws and Constitution. They're not very widely used. Some of them are used and then they're abused. Law is often used as an instrument of oppression. And some of them are used, but not quantitatively enough. So let's start with finding 10 people from various backgrounds who work up an agenda of what kind of country and its place in the world people of good intention and just spirits would like. Once this agenda is worked up, and needless to say, we're in the golden age of muckraking books and policy books and documentaries going nowhere, unfortunately. But once this agenda is worked up, it cannot have a left label, because, why handicap yourself? Furthermore, many of the things that I'm going to briefly mention could be supported by many people who don't call themselves left. They could be supported by libertarians, by authentic conservatives, by a variety of people in terms of how they identify themselves. So the agenda should be an agenda for justice, an agenda for cultural renewal, an agenda for environmental respect, and so forth. So 10 people get together and they hash out an agenda that they think will have wide support beyond any ideological niche or label. Then that goes to 1,000 people at a convention, which refines it, expands it, and dramatizes it. And then the next step, before the agenda is moved, 100,000 people in the country are asked to do the following. Do they agree with the agenda? Will they raise or contribute $200 a year? And will they contribute 200 volunteer hours a year, networked, heavily stratified in congressional districts, because a lot of what needs to be done inevitably, for the time being, has to go through Congress. And Congress is the Khyber Pass. It's a corporate Congress, but it's 535 people who put on their shoes every day like you and I, and thousands of organized people in congressional districts should be able to make enormous headway here. And Congress, of course, vectors the executive branch and the judicial branch. It's the most important branch under the Constitution. So once that 100,000 reaches that critical mass, and basically it's a pledge. That is, I will pledge if 990,000 pledge, so that people realize that it's not going to just be petering out and 50 people pledge and nothing happens. The pledge builds up to a momentum so that you raise $20 million a year. And then that expands in trying to get some enlightened, older super rich to put in hundreds of millions of dollars a year in order to organize every conceivable community in the country with full-time organizers selected by recruiters, finding the natural talent all over the country, and really getting political and economic motivation plus a cultural motivation moving. So what kind of directions would there be? Well, the first on the agenda is how do you shift power? How do you begin shifting power so the tools of democracy can be used by the people for a just society rather than the tools be used by commercial interests in just the opposite direction? And so there are all kinds of ways to do that once this basis that I just described is underway. You can do it by using the initiative, referendum, recall, by moving to get money out of politics, by refining the various strategies and tactics, by requiring inserts in mass mailings by corporations, banks, utility companies, and government, inviting people to join their own democratically elected nonprofit groups that a variety of advocacies and investigations and research and oversight. We need a crackdown on corporate crime. That requires, of course, adequate prosecutorial resources and a redefinition of the way corporate crime is treated in this country. We need a reduction in the military budget because that's destroying so much of our priorities. We need to get corporations off welfare. That's another distortion of public money. That is a zero-sum game and entrenches corporate power over our government, so we have a corporate government. We need fundamental tax return reform where before you tax labor, you first tax those activities which society likes the least or dislikes the most. That is, transactions on Wall Street, massive derivative speculation produces huge amount of revenue, or you tax pollution, the carbon tax, you tax gambling, all the various things that you want the tax system to diminish before you start taxing labor. And then, of course, you bring your corporate taxes back so that capital gains are taxed like ordinary income, etc. Then we need a whole concept of community economics, community self-reliance to displace the dependency on absentee multinational corporate giants. The framework is already there. It needs to be invigorated and expanded. For example, credit unions reduce the power of the big banks. Food, local food, the power of the agribusiness, including cooperative housing, community health, community energy systems. They all reduce the power of the big health insurance companies and the energy companies. And that, of course, will be associated with single-payer health insurance. Then there needs to be, very quickly, the transition to solar energy and renewable energy from fossil fuels and nuclear. There needs to be science for the people. We have corporate science dominating academic science, which means it commercializes and politically controls what academic science can do. And we need to apply science to human needs, from modern mass transit to water conservation, soil erosion, many other improvements in consumer products. We need to open up the political and legal systems for the people. That means we expand access to the courts for injured people, for defrauded people, reduce the costs of judicial access, expand the services of lawyers for the people, as well as reforming electoral barriers to non-major party candidates so that there can be a real competitive democracy and people can have much more choices than the two-party dictatorships, choice, Republican and Democrat. We need to also begin lifting the commercial exploitation of the family, especially the commercialization of childhood with violence, junk food, junk drink, all the things that are undermining parental authority, and advance ways to foster civic, spiritual, and aesthetic values. We need also civic skills and experience being taught in our schools, starting in elementary school, right through college. You have computer skills taught all the time. The most important skills that connect all knowledge are civic skills, classroom to community, back to classroom. We need to redefine the social compact with corporations, large corporations. We should have national charters, not Delaware charters or Nevada charters, which redefine the role of people, eliminate corporate personhood, and make sure that the stakeholders can hold these corporate bosses accountable, increasing investor rights, and many other versions of corporate reform that a lot of people have worked on. We need foreign relations. We need to move from a military, imperialist, empire-oriented superpower to a humanitarian superpower as a basis for a muscular foreign policy. And sports are a huge area. We need to move from spectator sports, which dominate sports now, to participatory sports, participatory arts and crafts, to contrast with the commercialization that leaves people on couches, gaining weight, and not refining and expanding their own human talents. We need also simple facilities, as I earlier mentioned. I would call them checkoffs. When you get your electric telephone bill, when you get your bank or insurance bill, there's always that invitation to join the nonprofit groups of consumers, workers, taxpayers, investors, all the various constituencies that have been disempowered or stripped of any kind of participatory role in democratic policy making. We need to organize in every congressional district a minimum of 2,000 people called Congress Watchdog Associations. That's to achieve long overdue reforms and take control of Congress away from the corporate lobbyists in Washington, who hire ex-congressmen, who ply existing members of Congress with money, who put their executives in very high government positions in major departments, from Department of Interior, Department of Defense, and Treasury, etc. We need to address the people's commonwealth. The people in this country are the legal owners of the greatest wealth. That's the trillions of dollars in pension funds, 1/3 of America, all the wealth of the public lands, onshore and offshore. The public airways belong to the people. Trillions of dollars of government research and development, which have built so much of the aerospace, semiconductor, biotech, pharmaceutical, containerization, computer industries. All these are controlled by corporations, even though they're owned by the people. So we have to move from the Commonwealth ownership to Commonwealth control through a variety of intermediate associations, so that the corporations become our servants, not our masters. And finally, we need a tiny number of enlightened, super-rich, older Americans to continue to provide the resources and contacts for mobilizing communities throughout the country and facilitating and shoehorning more and more civic and political energy that the Constitution, properly interpreted, can encourage.